Welcome to Arctic Frontiers Unpacked. Here today with me I have Ksenia Vakhrusheva. Yes?
Yes.
And she's leading the Bellona Arctic project, also being very involved in several of the Arctic and Russia-related topics discussed at Arctic Frontiers now. So thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. And I wanted to ask you, could you start by telling a little bit about Bellona's work in the Arctic?
Thank you, Serafima. Bellona is a environmental non-governmental organization. It has been working in the Arctic for quite many years and approached Arctic from different sides: sustainable shipping, fishing, nuclear risks. What I'm doing right now with my team is that we monitor and analyze what's going on in the Russian Arctic, in the Russian part of the Arctic, both on land and on the sea. And we try to identify what kind of risks the Russian current activity can bring to environment, what kind of pollution, transborder pollution we can expect, what kind of impact it has on the global climate, and other kind of risks, including radiation risk, nuclear risk, and all different kind of environmental impact.
So it sounds like to be able to assess all of these risks and understand and do your analysis, you have to have access to important information from Russia. So what I'm wondering is, which impacts can you see that the changed geopolitical landscape and the increased self-isolation, so to say, of Russia has on accessing this important information that you need?
I have to say that getting reliable environmental information from Russian official sources wasn't an easy task for many years. There was some time when it got better, but of course with the outbreak of the war, when Russia unlawfully invaded Ukraine, and the processes of self-isolation from other civilized world became even more harsher, then the state started to hide even more information that it used to hide before. And we work with the open sources. We try to look from our perspective on these bits of information that still we can get from officials, from civil society, from official data that is published, and analyze, see the trends, the bigger processes, and how they might affect the Russian Arctic and Arctic as a whole.
Thank you. And how do you think that these restrictions hinder the cooperation between not only inside of Russia and to understand Russia, but between, for example, Russia and the rest of the Arctic states? Is this there a barrier there?
Of course, there is a barrier because of the sanctions from the rest of the Arctic states and from self-isolation from the Russian side. For example, on the level of scientific institutions, universities, there is a barrier from both sides. On one side, it's restrictions of the Western countries to work with the Russian governmental institutions, and most of the universities in Russia are governmental structures. So the same kind of restrictions work from Russian side. That's Russian universities are not allowed to work with the Western governments and Western organizations, because Russian government consider Western countries as unfriendly, which causes certain consequences for cooperation. I know that the Arctic Council still has some low level of ties and links, and on the level of working groups, they do have contacts to keep sharing information at least somehow, which helps them in their scientific monitoring and modeling. For us, as a non-profit organization, it's even more difficult because we were declared undesirable organization in 2023, which means that for Russian nationals it's illegal to basically talk with us. And because we don't want to put anyone into risk, we don't persuade these active contacts. That's why we work with open information, but which is quite enough, I would say, to identify the main risks that exist in the Russian Arctic, which are pollution from mining industries. Russia wants to expand mining activities in the Russian Arctic in the nearest decade, exploring more oil fields, gas fields, minerals, and also risks along the Northern Sea route, which puts tremendous risk of oil spills and all kind of different risks associated with shipping on the unsafe route.
I mean, it's so important to hear you talk about this, because what you're essentially, what I hear here is that the risks are on several separate levels. We have the level of the actual communication between not only scientists but between the officials and Bellona, because you cannot communicate anymore in the same way. And you have all of these environmental risks at the same time. So there's many things you're meeting, many challenges you have to navigate. So what I'm wondering, when it comes to risks, one thing Bellona's work is very prominent about is especially nuclear risks. And you've been working with this for a long time. So radiation risks, they aren't really that frequently talked about in arenas when we talk about environmental change in the Arctic, but they are still very prominent and very important to address. So what I wonder is, what specific nuclear or radiation risks can you see are emerging, and how do they affect the current state of the Arctic? Either it be environmentally or it be, well, in the science policy landscape, that is.
Speaking about the nuclear risks in the Arctic, we can separate a couple of them with different regions. One is nuclear waste legacy that we still have on the Russian Northwest Arctic, left from Soviet times. That's Novaya Zemlya as a former, but still still keeping as a nuclear test site, ready to use. They don't use it for now, but it's kept ready. It's also sunken radioactive objects in the northern seas, which are not cleared yet. And this is the thing that remain one of the major radiation risk in the Arctic, because before the outbreak of the war, Western governments, including Norway, were helping Russian Rosatom and Russian government to slowly clean up the most dangerous nuclear objects which were dumped in the northern seas. They started this process, they had certain successes, but after February 2022, it stopped. And we are afraid that Russia and Rosatom, they are not able to continue this work on their own. And they actually are not willing to do this. They are not their priority at current times. So this is one thing. Another radiation and possible potential nuclear risk that can be identified is the rising number of nuclear icebreakers for civil use, but also nuclear vessels for military use, which are also located in the Arctic zone. We don't have any examples with accidents on nuclear icebreakers recently, but it still remains the risks. The more vessels like that we have, the greater risk potentially can be. And here the main thing is that with the current state of affairs, if something happens, it will be very difficult for international community to find out about this timely. Russia will for sure try to hide this information first. Of course, later it will be found out, but this timely knowledge would be left. Also, Rosatom is planning quite few nuclear power projects along the Arctic coast associated with the new mining industries, new mining sites. In order to power new plants, they would like to suggest this their new technology of small modular reactors, which they will actually test there. And all the risks associated with introducing the new technology in the Arctic zone, that is there. We don't know whether it, when exactly this will be in power, because Western sanctions right now delay some of the projects, some of the mining projects. But the ambition that Russian government has associated with the Arctic so-called development is very high. So that the risk is also high.
I can imagine. And when you mentioned especially the thing with if there were to happen any accident or any form of risks to be realized, then there most likely wouldn't be much public knowledge about it, or Russian authorities would do everything they can to hide it. And I am wondering about Bellona's role in this. Is it that are you having any? Is it that we would likely then hear from you that something would happen, or what is Bellona's role in this sort of?
Of course, we will try to monitor what's happening there, but we're not that large organization to be able to monitor like a field on the field what's happening actually there. So we're identifying the most probable risks that governments on the West should be aware of, and maybe they should closer monitor with their much heavier resources what's going on there, so that they can be prepared to react.
And it is, and that's very important. What you're emphasizing now also is that the role that the state plays, that you have like these NGOs to try to support and say, hello, look at this, something is happening here, please bring attention to it. And this is bringing me over to the next question, is that we have seen mitigating this, and you mentioned the state level, but is there anything that can happen regionally or on the local level that can mitigate these kinds of risks? Or is it more strictly like nation state-based that you want the entire monitoring to increase?
It is difficult to talk about civil society in the context of Russia nowadays.
Of course.
Especially in the Arctic, because Arctic is considered as a special interest zone for Russian government with a heavy military presence, which means that the pressure on civil society there even more than in other parts of Russia. Also, Russian Arctic is not that populated, and it was already difficult to get some local activity there even before the war, which now makes it almost impossible. Local governments in Russia are in general very weak, so I don't think that you can expect anything from local governments there. In addressing major risks in the Russian Arctic, it's only on the national level.
And that, I think, brings us also to the last question that I have when it comes to this, is that it is clear that something needs to be done, and in Bellona you are doing everything you can to encourage this form of action. And what I am wondering about is if you could reflect a little bit upon is, what lessons do you think decision shapers or decision makers at, for example, Arctic Frontiers, or in general who have a role in these kinds of issues, what lessons do you think they can have or learn from the risks and the crisis we are in today to have at least some form of a better environmental cooperation for the future?
First of all, I would like to stress another thing, that apart from addressing environmental and climate risks in the Arctic, which are originating from Russia, we shall not forget that Russia is still invading Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
Someone is fueling this war with money.
Yes.
Russian Arctic is a source of natural resources, which Russia sends to on export for export. And those who buy these resources indirectly supports the Russian budget, Russian war budget, which allow Russia to continue this war. And our primary concern is that Western governments are still, and Western companies are still buying resources from the Russian Arctic, including LNG, natural gas in the form of fertilizers, indirectly Russian oil products from Russian oil reproduced in other countries.
Supporting this war machine, essentially.
Yes, so they still didn't stop the flow of money. And it is important to remember that right now we need to focus our efforts to stop the war, and not to forget that the primary thing is that Russian economy is dependent on selling resources. So extracting these resources is not only fueling the war through export money, but also damaging the environment and climate, especially in this fragile environment of the Arctic. So this difficult thing that can Western governments do is to cut this money flow to Russia. And then probably it will benefit Ukraine, it will benefit people in Russia as well, and it will benefit the environment and climate in the Arctic.
Thank you for a very, very strong point here. It's been lovely to have you here, and
thank you.
Thank you for participating. And thank you for listening.